Today, I want to talk about one of the more recent Russian moves in order to isolate and break up the European coalition against them. Over the course of the last few days, the Russians have started limiting natural gas supplies specifically to Bulgaria and Poland with the intent of forcing on the rest of Europe payment in rubles specifically. And there are a number of economic entities, not governments at this point, just private players in Germany, Austria, and Hungary that are agitating within the European system to be able to do just that, because the Austrians, the Germans, and the Hungarians are particularly wired in to the Russian system.
Is another very stark reminder that we need to work with reliable partners and build our energy independence.
So first, a few words on infrastructure. There are a number of pipes from the Russian space that go into the European space that allow the Russians to selectively cut off specific countries. So, for example, there's the Nord Stream line, which is the biggest of them, which goes under the Baltic Sea directly to Germany, which would allow the Russians, if they wanted to specifically cut off the Germans. But they're trying to pry the Germans out of the coalition, so that is still flowing. And gas from that line passes on to places like Hungary and Austria. There are older lines that go through the Ukrainian space into Bulgaria, and that's exactly what they're doing with the Bulgarians. They're just shutting that line off. There's our downstream customers, but they're not very big, so it'll be very easy for the Russians to know if the Bulgarians are tapping the line against the Russian wishes. Same thing is happening with something called the Yamal line that goes through Belarus into Poland. So what the Russians are trying to do is get some countries to violate their contracts. The Russians are obviously violating their own. Obviously, from a legal point of view, this is a war. But the Europeans love a good meeting. They love a good bureaucracy. So anything that puts problems within the gears, throw some sand into the operation. That's what the Russians are after. Now, the European Union Commission president has already said that any payments in rubles are clearly against the sanctions regime. But this is the first time the Europeans have had a meaningful sanctions regime versus everything. Now, this kind of takes us two places. First of all, the big picture. In my opinion, the takeaway capacity for Russian energy has been dropped so much between sanctions and boycotts that we're seeing pressure build up through the entire Russian system all the way to the wellheads. And once that happens, the Russians are going to have to shut in a lot of production. So at the end of the day, at some point this summer, all of this is going to go away anyway, and it's going to seem like a moot point globally. And globally it is. But that's not what the Russians are after. The Russians are after kind of the second point, which is if they can get cracks and fissures within the European coalition to open up over energy, then they have a lot more breathing room. The ultimate goal, kind of the gold standard for the Russians, would be to get the Germans to no longer participate in the sanctions and boycotts at all. And if the Germans do that, the Austrians and the Hungarians who could be counted on to be brought along for the ride. If the Russians can get the Germans to no longer play in the war, that is pretty much all the logistical capacity for the entire NATO alliance for shipping things into Ukraine. That's ultimately what the Russians are after here. And they have a reasonably good chance of getting it. The Russians know that the Germans have very few options. They don't have the ability to import natural gas from the sea. They don't have a single LNG terminal. They don't have the ability to reroute crude because the two refineries that they have that use Russian crude exclusively are landlocked and they have no connection to ports. So the Europeans are going to have to get very creative here. Now, luckily, the Europeans have shown a degree of creativity that we haven't seen out of them for decades. So, for example, about 3 weeks into the war, the Europeans linked up their electrical grid to the Ukrainian grid. Now, Ukraine has 45 million people. It's about the same size as Texas. That's kind of a big deal. And they did it in 2 weeks. So there's a possibility they can do the same thing for the Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Germans. And the French basically turn all of their nuclear power plants up to max and start shipping electricity in. And the Italians probably will do something similar, although they'll be using different fuels, probably coal and even burning oil. But there are ways here to prevent this from being catastrophic. The reason that this is happening at all is not simply because the Germans have tried to preserve some degree of relationship with Russia. It's a lot deeper than that. The Germans are surrounded by potential rivals. And anything that they can do in a time of peace to prevent those rivals from becoming hostile is something that they will do. And that's been German policy since 1950. We're past that, though. While there are certainly some German interests economically that would like to preserve the relationship, the Russians are not going to stop. And in Berlin, at the state level, the Germans have accepted this, and they're starting to build that alternate infrastructure. What they need is time. A cutoff today would end manufacturing in Germanocentric Europe. That is the heart of the European economy. They would fall not into recession, but into depression. So every day that they can buy to add more infrastructure to bring in alternative options is a gift. And the Russians know that. And so the Russians are pushing for this now. Historically, I've not been a big fan of the European Union. I mean, I love their goal. I love the idea of peace and democracy and unity in Europe. I think that's great. I just don't think it's very feasible, especially in the world we're devolving into, where overwatch by the United States is in question. But the Russians have moved so far, so fast, so angrily, so rudely, that Europe is experiencing the greatest moment of unity that they have had since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That's kind of a big deal. So I do have a little bit of hope. But ultimately, the decision here rests with Berlin, and we're going to know within like a couple of weeks how this is going to break down. Because the Russians aren't going to stop, but Poland and Bulgaria are hardly the last countries that they're going to use in order to drive a wedge between the Germans and everyone else.
Gazprom's announcement that it is unilaterally stopping gas deliveries to certain EU member states is another provocation from the Kremlin. But it comes as no surprise that the Kremlin uses fossil fuels to try to blackmail us. This is something the European Commission has been preparing for in close coordination and solidarity with member states and international partners. Our response will be immediate, united, and coordinated.
Red is natural gas pipelines, and the green is oil pipelines. Now, oil and agriculture are expressly not covered in the sanctions that have put on Russia to date, but insurers are refusing to cover ships operating in the northern half of the Black Sea, and ship captains are refusing to dock at St. Petersburg. So we have a de facto global sanction on Russian agricultural exports already. Now, Russian ports are not sufficiently deep to take full ocean-going tankers or cargo vessels. It's relatively small, the size of vessels that can dock. So even if ship captains and insurers allowed it, and even if the sanctions don't cover these sectors in the future, they will still need to reload somewhere else. So the degree that things have to go perfectly right for Russian agriculture to continue to play a global role just is not going to happen this year. The general outrage is so high, and the insurers are so hostile to the very concept of picking up or even sailing into Russian ports that you should count on most Russian output being locked up. Now, that might loosen in a few places, but you should now count on that being the norm. About the only single spot where there may be an exception is Turkey could use its navy to escort vessels in and out of the Russian Black Sea ports and offer sovereign indemnification insurance for the vessels in order to supply itself and maybe a handful of countries in the Middle East that it would like to influence. But that is really the only player here that has the interest and the capability to do anything. Everything else is going to be locked down. Any other exports from Russia must be by rail, and the Russian rail system is already maxed out. So any sort of increases are going to be very incremental.